Carandiru Massacre. The prison that was already dead in the heart of São Paulo once stood a prison so large, so crowded, and so unstable that it functioned less like a correctional facility and more like a sealed-off city in collapse. That prison was Carandiru Prison. By the time the massacre occurred in 1992, Carandiru was already broken. The violence that followed did not erupt from nowhere. It was the final outcome of years of neglect, overcrowding, and institutional abandonment. The massacre was not the beginning of Carandiru's tragedy. It was the moment the world finally noticed. A prison built for control, swallowed by numbers. Carandiru Prison was opened in the early 20th century as a modern penal institution. At the time, it symbolized order, discipline, and progress in Brazil's prison system. It had medical wards, administrative offices, and multiple pavilions designed to separate inmates by classification. But São Paulo grew rapidly, and the prison system failed to keep pace. As crime increased and arrests multiplied, Carandiru absorbed more people than it was ever designed to hold. Cells built for a small number of inmates housed many times that amount. Hallways became sleeping areas. Sanitation systems failed under constant strain. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Carandiru held thousands more inmates than its official capacity. Overcrowding did not just reduce comfort. It destroyed control. When authority withdraws, violence moves. In prisons rely on visibility and authority. Guards must be able to see, intervene, and enforce rules consistently. At Carandiru, that became impossible. Entire pavilions fell outside effective state control. Guards remained at gates and perimeters, avoiding deep entry into overcrowded cell blocks where their safety could not be guaranteed. This created a vacuum. Inside the prison, inmates formed their own structures of order. Hierarchies emerged. Power was enforced through intimidation and violence. Disputes were settled internally, not by officials. The state still owned Carandiru. But it no longer governed daily life inside it. Violence as a survival system. Violence at Carandiru was not constant chaos. It was structured, purposeful, and often preventative. Inmates used violence to establish boundaries, enforce rules, and protect territory. Fear became a currency. Respect became survival. This made Carandiru especially dangerous. Not because violence was always happening, but because it could happen at any moment. There was no stable peace. Only temporary calm. The illusion of containment from the outside, Carandiru appeared contained. High walls, watchtowers, and armed guards suggested control. Inside, the reality was different. The prison functioned as a closed ecosystem. Contraband circulated. Informal economies thrived. Leadership structures existed beyond the reach of official authority. The state tolerated this reality for years. As long as violence stayed inside the walls, it was largely ignored. That tolerance would prove fatal. The culture of neglect. Carandiru was not violent because guards were cruel or inmates were uniquely dangerous. It was violent because no one intervened early enough. Reports warned of overcrowding. Human rights groups documented abuse. Medical staff reported deteriorating conditions. Each warning was acknowledged. None were acted upon decisively. Neglect became policy by default. The day tension finally exploded on October 2, 1992, violence erupted inside one of Carandiru's pavilions. It began as a fight between inmates, not a riot, not an organized rebellion. But in a prison already saturated with fear and resentment, escalation was immediate. Guards withdrew. Control collapsed. For the first time in years, the state faced the reality it had avoided. Carandiru was no longer manageable from the outside. Calling in the military police. Faced with chaos inside the pavilion, São Paulo authorities made a critical decision. Military police were deployed. This decision transformed a prison disturbance into a national crisis. Armed officers entered a facility designed for containment, not combat. The imbalance of power was immediate and overwhelming. The objective was clear: restore control at any cost. The operation that followed the intervention was fast. Within hours, resistance ended. When silence returned to Carandiru, the number of dead stunned the country. More than 100 inmates were killed. Most were unarmed. A massacre, not a riot. Official statements initially framed the operation as a necessary response to violent uprising. But evidence quickly challenged that narrative. Autopsies, witness testimony, independent investigations. Together, they painted a picture not of mutual combat, but of overwhelming force used against inmates who posed little threat at the moment of intervention. Carandiru was no longer just a violent prison. It was the site of one of the deadliest prison massacres in modern history. Brazil and the world react. News of the massacre spread rapidly. International human rights organizations condemned the operation. Journalists exposed the conditions that led to it. Families demanded answers. Carandiru became a symbol, not only of prison violence, but of state failure. The world asked a question Brazil could no longer avoid: how did it come to this? Responsibility without accountability. In the aftermath, investigations began. Some officers were charged. Trials dragged on for years. Convictions were issued, overturned, reduced, and delayed. Responsibility became fragmented. Overcrowding was blamed on courts. Neglect was blamed on budgets. Violence was blamed on inmates. No single institution accepted full responsibility. Justice, like control before it, dissolved. The prison that could not survive its own history, Carandiru Prison, never recovered. Its legitimacy was destroyed. Its reputation was irreversible. The state eventually closed the prison and demolished its structures. In its place, public spaces were built, an attempt to reclaim the land and erase the past. But memory does not disappear with concrete. When the shooting stopped inside Carandiru Prison, silence replaced chaos with an almost unnatural weight. What had taken years to decay collapsed in a matter of hours. The corridors that once echoed with noise, movement, and fear were now still, filled with bodies and unanswered questions. For the Brazilian state, the operation was declared over. For the prison system, the consequences were only beginning. The official count would later confirm that 111 inmates were killed during the intervention. None of the military police officers involved died. This imbalance immediately raised doubts about the narrative of a violent riot requiring overwhelming force. As details emerged, it became clear that the massacre was not the result of mutual combat, but of a unilateral use of lethal power inside a space already stripped of order. Autopsies revealed that many inmates had been shot multiple times, some at close range. Ballistic reports suggested that several were killed in areas where resistance would have been impossible. These findings contradicted early claims that officers acted solely in self-defense. The image of Carandiru shifted decisively, from a dangerous prison to a site of state violence. In the days that followed, survivors were transferred or isolated. Some were moved to other facilities without explanation, others held in silence while investigations slowly began. Families of the dead gathered outside the prison walls, demanding information. Many were not immediately told whether their relatives were alive or dead. Identification of bodies took time. Closure took longer. Brazilian society reacted with shock, but also with division. For some, the massacre was seen as a tragic but necessary act, proof that the state had finally reasserted authority over a prison that had been lost to criminal control. For others, it was an unforgivable abuse of power, the inevitable result of abandoning reform in favor of force. International human rights organizations quickly condemned the operation. Reports described a prison system that had allowed conditions to deteriorate until violence was unavoidable, then responded with extreme measures rather than structural change. Carandiru became a global case study in what happens when incarceration systems fail incrementally and then collapse catastrophically. Legal proceedings began, but they moved slowly. The complexity of assigning responsibility inside a system defined by neglect made accountability difficult. Was blame to be placed on the officers who pulled the triggers, the commanders who gave the orders, or the political leaders who tolerated Carandiru's conditions for years? Over time, charges were brought against dozens of military police officers. Trials stretched across decades. Some convictions were handed down, only to be overturned on appeal. Sentences were reduced. Others were annulled entirely. Each legal reversal reinforced a painful reality for victims' families: justice, like control before it, was fragmented and fragile. The broader prison system absorbed the shock unevenly. In the immediate aftermath, authorities promised reform. New prisons were planned. Policies were rewritten. Oversight mechanisms were discussed. Yet overcrowding continued across Brazil. Violence persisted in other facilities. Carandiru had exposed the problem, but exposure did not equal resolution. Eventually, the decision was made to close Carandiru Prison entirely. The facility was gradually emptied, then demolished. Its massive concrete structures were torn down, replaced by a public park and cultural spaces. The transformation was symbolic, an attempt to erase a site of trauma and replace it with something open and communal. But memory does not disappear with demolition. For survivors, families, and activists, Carandiru remained present. Books, films, and testimonies preserved the story. Each retelling challenged the idea that the massacre was an isolated incident rather than the predictable outcome of long-term neglect. What made the Carandiru Massacre uniquely significant was not just the number of deaths, but what it revealed about power. For years, the state had withdrawn from meaningful governance inside the prison, allowing inmates to impose their own order. When the state finally returned, it did so not with reform or negotiation, but with overwhelming force. The result was not restored legitimacy, but irreversible loss of trust. Carandiru demonstrated that prisons cannot be ignored until they explode. Overcrowding is not a temporary inconvenience, it is a destabilizing force. When institutions fail quietly, they accumulate risk. When that risk is finally addressed through violence, the consequences are permanent. The massacre also reshaped how Brazil was viewed internationally. It placed the country under scrutiny for its prison conditions and use of force. While reforms followed in some areas, the fundamental challenge remained: how to balance security, human dignity, and accountability within a system under constant pressure. Today, Carandiru no longer exists physically, but its legacy persists wherever prisons are overcrowded, underfunded, and politically invisible. It stands as a warning that incarceration without governance leads not to containment, but to catastrophe. The Carandiru Massacre was not inevitable because violence is human nature. It was inevitable because warning signs were ignored, responsibility was deferred, and solutions were postponed. When action finally came, it arrived too late and too violently. What happened at Carandiru forces a difficult conclusion. Prisons do not fail suddenly. They fail slowly, through neglect disguised as tolerance. And when the cost of that failure is finally paid, it is paid in lives.